A woman called Glynis dialed 999 to report that she was worried about her boyfriend, William Spiller. She hadn't seen him in a while, and although she had spoken to him via text message, she'd not actually spoken to him face to face or on the phone. She suspected something was seriously wrong, but couldn't put her finger on what it was, and so she requested a welfare check. When officers got to Stedman Road, Southbourne, and approached the apartment block that William lived in with his adult son, they were immediately met with the sight of hundreds of flies crowding around the windows of the block. And as they got closer to the front door of the flat, the unmistakable stench of death. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source materials I can find. You can find all episodes that are on YouTube as a podcast version, available in the description box down below. After Glynis had called 999, Dorset police agreed to send officers to William's home address, and it didn't take them long to arrive. Once they were there, not only did they notice the hundreds of flies and the stench, but they also got no answer despite knocking a number of times. Their first port of call was to try and gain some sort of understanding about whether anyone else had heard from or seen William. And so they started knocking door to door until finally they got some useful information. They managed to speak to one of William's downstairs neighbours, and this neighbour confirmed that although they hadn't seen him any time recently, they had noticed a strong stench coming from the floor that William's flat was on, and on top of that, they had actually noticed something odd coming from William's apartment. It was a pinky substance, and the neighbour had noticed it because it had started dripping through his bathroom ceiling. Now, this incident had happened a few weeks before, and he'd noticed this substance on the same night he heard some troubling things coming from William's apartment. At some point during the night, the neighbour had heard William and his son, Nathan, having an argument. This wasn't necessarily abnormal for the father-son duo. They often argued, and in fact, on a previous evening, the neighbour had heard them arguing specifically about finances. It was a well-known fact that Nathan, who was 27 years old, didn't work and pretty much lived off of his dad. He wasn't paying rent or bills, and he even borrowed money from his dad as a regular occurrence. Although these kind of arguments weren't out of the ordinary, the neighbour hadn't just been able to ignore this argument this time, partially because it seemed worse than some of the others, but also now there was that pink substance leaking through his bathroom ceiling. And so that neighbour had gone up the stairs, knocked on the apartment door, and a few moments later, Nathan answered, and he asked what the neighbour wanted. They simply replied that they just wanted to check everything was okay because they'd heard this shouting and these arguments, and they went on to mention about this pink substance. Nathan assured the other neighbour that he and his dad were just in a bit of a heated argument, but everything was fine now and it had all calmed down. And as for the pink substance, he said he didn't know what it was, but he'd certainly take a look, and he told the neighbour he didn't need to worry. But fast forward to now, with no sight of William over the last couple of weeks. And by the way, I will just say that the timing of this section is a little bit fuzzy. There's multiple conflicting reports, and there is no official documentation that spoke of specific timelines between when William was last seen and this eventual welfare check. But either way, the officers were concerned enough to force entry into the apartment. Once they got through that front door, the smell became even stronger, and so they continued forward into the front room. And there they could see a number of plastic boxes, and they were clear, and they were covered in hundreds and hundreds of flies. And inside those plastic boxes, they could see pretty much straight away there were a number of human body parts. On further inspection of the surrounding areas, they ended up opening up a filing cabinet, and inside that they found a human head. Obviously at this point, the assumption is that the body parts belonged to William, but they needed to do some more research to find out if this was the case. And so the autopsy was conducted on the body parts, and it was found that all of them were from one person. A concern that the officers had when they found this gruesome scene was that perhaps there was more than one body. There were a number of different boxes, and it wasn't obvious by any means if all of these body parts were just from one person. And so those remains were transported back to the morgue, where they were identified as belonging to someone who they identified as a man. They said he was white, he stood at 6'3", and he would have weighed over 20 stone. It was clear that the man had been severed through the joints, and to do this, the perpetrator would have used some kind of saw. The cuts were not neat, and they were clearly made by someone who did not have very much experience, if any experience, of any kind of medical training. This was very much a needs-must kind of situation. The remains were, of course, identified officially as William Spiller, and so the investigation into who murdered him began. The officers honed in on one key suspect. It was clear that there really was only one person who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. And that man, unsurprisingly, was William's 27-year-old son, Nathan Robertson. Nathan had actually called 999 to report that a friend of his had been in touch and said that his dad had gone missing. And so Nathan wanted to know what was going on.
My friend also phoned me up saying that my dad's gone missing or something, or someone's reported him missing.
Right, so where does your father live?
He lives down in Bournemouth. Lacey Court.
Lacey Court?
Yeah, L-A-C-Y.
Yeah.
Court, that's 7 Stedman Road. Said that the police went round, and that's how you managed to get my telephone number. Police went round to a house looking for him.
When?
But the thing is, I actually know where he is, which is quite weird.
What's his name?
William Spiller.
So where is he then?
He's up with his friends. His friends got cancer, so he's been stopping with him.
A friend in...
Friend in Kidderminster.
In Kidderminster?
Yeah. Actually due to come and see me today. His phone's been broken. So I've been in contact with him through his friend's phone, because he's been up visiting his friend who's dying of cancer at the moment.
On the 18th of June 2013, officers turned up at Nathan's mum's house, where he was arrested and charged with theft, unlawful disposal of human remains, and of course, the murder of William Spiller, his dad. When he heard he was being arrested, his response was, quote, "Is this a joke?" And so Nathan denied murder, instead claiming diminished responsibility. He accepted that he had committed this brutal act, but he said that he had a blank spot in his memory of what he'd done at the time that his dad had died. He said he blacked out, and then the first thing he remembered was coming to and being in the shower, washing blood and watching it just run off of him and down the drain in front of him. Nathan had been living with his dad, William, and the pair's relationship had been pretty tense for a fair while. As we know, Nathan wasn't contributing to any of the bills or payment for living with his dad. Nathan is 27 years old at this point, and he'd decided that he wasn't going to work. He wasn't going to move out. He was just going to live there and continue to sort of live off of his dad for as long as he possibly could. As the investigation continued, it became very clear that Nathan didn't have any kind of remorse for what he'd done. Just the state of the crime scene showed this. After Nathan had placed his dad's remains in those plastic see-through boxes, he proceeded to then place the boxes on top of one another and then placed a TV on top of those, presumably to get it in a bit of a better or more convenient position so he could watch TV. The man's dad's body parts are visible right there in front of him, and he's concerned with getting the right position to watch TV. It is incredibly clear that there is absolutely no remorse for what he's done. He can just sit there with his dad's body parts right in front of him. Wild. After that, Nathan began to clean up, and to do the dismemberment, he'd used a Stanley knife, a saw, and a hacksaw. That was to actually dismember the different body parts. And there's no doubt that there would have been an awful lot of blood. And the investigating team knew this. They did find that sort of pink liquid that the neighbour had reported throughout the home. And it was later determined that this pink liquid was a mixture of blood and bleach. And it had just sort of coagulated together and become pink. And there was so much of it that, as we know, it had leaked downstairs. Now, once Nathan had cleaned the home, at least partially, he then went on to steal at least £7,750 of his dad's money. And then, and this is a little bizarre, I don't know if there's some information I maybe couldn't access, or if it's just perhaps another unhinged action on Nathan's part, but he then used some of that money to pay rent and bills, as in pay for the house that he was sharing with his dad. And that was the reason for a lot of their arguments. I'm not sure what the sense was in doing this, unless he was planning on getting away with it and continuing to live in this house on his own. That could have been a part of the plan. It's certainly possible, especially as we know that the dismemberment and the sort of cleanup operation had started inside that home and could well have continued to the point where his dad could have just disappeared. But this doesn't really explain why there were very few other things that were in place to cover up the crime. Although he'd attempted to impersonate William by using his phone and texting his friends and his long-term girlfriend, even saying that he was going to be staying away with a friend in the West Midlands for a bit, beyond that, Nathan didn't make any attempt to cover up his tracks or even give himself an alibi. There was a lot that he just didn't do that would ultimately lead to his eventual arrest. Either way, he went on to use the rest of the money to buy various miscellaneous things that he just fancied buying, and now he had all of this money to do that. And then it seems that he travelled to see his mum. He wanted to treat his mum, and so he used his dead dad's money to take her out for the weekend. He even treated her to this vegan spa day in Bristol, all the while pretending that he was just using his own money and obviously keeping completely quiet about the fact that he had just days earlier murdered his dad. Nathan also used the money to take a trip to Scotland with a number of his friends, where they all drank and partied, all whilst his dad's body parts are decaying back at the home that he knows he's going to be returning to. During the course of the trial, the downstairs neighbour was called to testify, and he pretty much confirmed what he told officers in that statement about hearing a struggle upstairs, and even at this point saying that he had heard William ask Nathan to call him an ambulance. A few hours after that, the neighbour was in his home when he saw that pink liquid, which we now know to be the bleach and the blood mixed together, and that liquid was dripping through his bathroom ceiling and down the walls. And that neighbour then went upstairs, as we know, to knock on the door and let Nathan and William know that something was happening in their apartment and they maybe needed to look into it, sort it out, let him know that everything was going to be okay. But of course, we know that by this point William was dead, and so that's when Nathan answered the door and informed the neighbour that nothing was wrong, and said that he would check to see if there were any leakages or where the liquid might be coming from. It was clear at this point that he was already starting to cover up the crime. He was using the bleach, he was telling the neighbour not to worry. And the neighbour added in his testimony that when Nathan answered the door, he seemed, quote, very calm, just normal, very collected. By all accounts, the neighbour didn't appear to be suspicious of any of Nathan's behaviour because he was being pretty normal. Despite Nathan's claims of having blacked out and only come to when he'd been in the shower washing blood off of him, Nathan changed his story at the last minute at trial. Now, He claimed he remembered more of what had happened. He said he remembered his dad being sat on the bed, and he did actually remember stabbing him. And then he also went on to say that although he didn't remember it all, there were parts of the dismemberment that he said had come back to him, but that was pretty much it. The prosecution presented the fact that prior to the murder, William had agreed to support his son financially while he continued his higher education studies. But what William didn't know was that Nathan had dropped out of university and he was not planning on going back. It's not exactly clear how this next part happened, but at some point, William did find out that his son had dropped out of university and he wasn't going to go back. And so he decided to set some boundaries with him. If he was going to continue living under his dad's roof, the first thing that was going to happen would be Nathan would need to get a job. And as soon as he did get that job, he'd have to start paying back the money he owed his dad. And he had borrowed a lot of money from his dad, a grand total of £36,000. More evidence was presented to the court, and the jury heard about what the neighbour had witnessed in terms of the arguments between father and son, and one of them being that he'd actually heard William ask, quote, "Do you expect me to keep subsidising you for the rest of my life?" William's long-term girlfriend Glynis was also called to testify, and she revealed that Nathan would use any chance he could to get money from his dad. He'd even been given money in the past, specifically for the reason of paying insurance on both the taxi his dad used for work and another car. But Nathan hadn't used that money to pay for the insurance. Instead, he'd taken it, then stolen it and just spent it on other things, meaning that William actually ended up in court for charges relating to those unpaid insurances. Thankfully, he was able to explain the situation and eventually was given an absolute discharge, but this was serious. And he knew at this point that his son Nathan really had a problem, and he shared these worries with his long-term partner Glynis. He said things needed to change, and that meant he had to really look at his relationship with Nathan. It became clear that Nathan not only had a problem with stealing, and he couldn't or wouldn't get a job, but he also had a drinking problem. At trial, William's girlfriend Glynis said that William had become very concerned about his son's drinking, and he was vocal about this. Glynis herself was horrified one time when William showed her some text messages that he'd received from Nathan. And in these text messages that Nathan had sent, it was clear that he was drunk one time and that they were about Glynis. Quote, this is a quote from Glynis, "He was angry, but it was clear from the text messages that it appeared that Nathan had been drinking when he sent them, so Will made excuses for his behaviour." We obviously know that William wasn't around to be able to speak at the trial. We can only hear from people that knew him well, and although that included a number of his loved ones, including Glynis and other family members and friends, it unfortunately also did include Nathan. And Nathan told the court that he had suffered at the hands of his dad. He started by saying that his mum had been a sex worker and this had affected him greatly. Nathan then went on to claim that when he was just 13 years old, he was sexually abused by his dad. He said that as a result of this, he'd suffered from PTSD. And this was very much the major part of Nathan's defence. Of course, the prosecution refuted this, saying that it was a convenient way to victimise himself and lay blame on his dad, who obviously couldn't be there to defend himself. And look, we don't know either way. The abuse that Nathan claimed to have happened to him, it couldn't be proven, and of course it couldn't be disproven. However, it was suggested at the trial that the fact that Nathan actively chose to stay at his dad's house well into his 20s, into his late 20s, rather than living independently or even living with his mum, It was argued that that showed that this abuse defence was likely untrue. In all honesty, we'll never know the truth of that one. We know people who are suffering with PTSD symptoms can snap and exhibit behaviour completely out of the ordinary for them. Either way, I couldn't find any kind of official diagnosis of PTSD with regards to Nathan, but he did use this in his trial, and so it was certainly something his defence agreed to use at trial. Nathan also did admit to having an alcohol addiction, and as a result of this, he swore he'd forgotten or blanked out most of the night in question. It was only at his trial, as part of his defence, that he also brought in that it could be PTSD. His whole defence doesn't feel hugely cohesive or convincing, to be honest, but I guess that's all he could use. Nathan's crime was incredibly brutal and seemed like overkill in terms of both the weapons he used as well as the method he used to dismember his dad's body and then place it in those containers. And there was some evidence that pointed to a potential inspiration. I don't want to sensationalize this. I actually don't think there's a huge amount to do with the methods he chose and this thing that the prosecution brought up. But as it was brought up at trial, I do think it's worth mentioning. When Nathan was cross-examined by the prosecutor, he actually admitted that the very day after the murder, he had taken his box set of 7 Saw films to a friend to, quote, get rid of it. The prosecutor persisted and asked, quote, you took them because they first of all reflected what you did to your father in some way. But Nathan, still maintaining that he couldn't remember most of what he'd done, said that he didn't know, so couldn't answer. And so the prosecutor went on and asked why he had given them away at all. What was the reason? And Nathan answered that he was trying to distance himself from it. He added that he hadn't seen all of the films, just the first one, and he had seen that when he went to the cinema, so many years ago. But if you know the Saw movies, you'll know that the first one is notorious for being the one where the main game revolves around the characters sawing off their own ankles. It's not a huge stretch, but as I said earlier, I also don't think it's got a huge amount to do with the method that he used in terms of dismembering his father's body parts. Although there's no telling, really, it certainly could have been a partial inspiration. Nathan did, however, say in court that the content of the films was very much horror and gore and a form of torture, and he added that they usually did involve some form of dismemberment. Either way, the stance that Nathan was taking was that he didn't even like horror films, and the Saw films belonged to his dad, not to him. Ultimately, the jury took just 90 minutes to find Nathan guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Thank you for watching or listening to this episode of Red Rum. I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.